and welcome to the Sunday Guardian show by Joyeeta Basu. Now that the US election have started and the results are expected perhaps in less than 12 hours or maybe a little longer than that, which way is the election headed? Who is likely to win? What exactly the issues are this time? And what the impact will be on the American electorate and America as well as the world. To discuss all this and more, I have with me a very special guest, Clifford Smith, who is lawyer, former congressional staffer, freelance columnist, who has also occasionally written for us in the Sunday Guardian. Welcome, Cliff, to the show.
Thanks, Joyeeta.
Okay. So tell me, which way do you think the elections? I think it's election day already in the US.
It is election day. It is 8 in the morning here in Washington, D.C. And, I will tell you something that might not be satisfying, but I think is true. Nobody really knows where this is going. You can look at this election in 100 different ways, and it's like seeing mirror images of each other. If you look at American elections, for example, usually if you look at the numbers in terms of polls that show the country is going in the right direction or the wrong direction, if the country is going in the wrong direction, the incumbent party loses. At the same time, if you look at personal approval ratings of the candidates, usually the candidate with the higher personal approval rating wins. But those go in opposite directions, for example. People think the country is going in the wrong direction, but they also don't approve of Donald Trump. You also look at incumbents. Incumbents usually win. But who's the incumbent? Donald Trump is a former president. Kamala Harris is the sitting vice president. So again, you don't really know which way that swings. I could name another half dozen factors, that would say the same thing. They go both ways, and it's very hard to tell. What's more, you have multiple problems with the polling in terms of most of the polls in most of the, not only nationally, but also in the swing states, show the race extremely close, like within a percent or two. So close that, you really can't draw much of a conclusion from those polls. However, to complicate things even further, there have been a number of stories from places as prominent as the New York Times and all the way down the line that have said there have been pollsters that have conducted polls, but then feared that their polls were wrong and decided not to release the results. Now, that tells me there's a herding effect. In other words, everybody sees a similar race and everybody doesn't want to be seen as the outlier, and so they're not releasing things that don't fit with the consensus. Here's what I can tell you. I sincerely doubt that, the races in all the swing states are within a point or two. I think it's much more likely that some of those outlier polls that aren't being released are more likely that people fear are outliers or fear are done wrong somehow are closer to the truth. The problem is, I don't know which way those swing. I don't know if those are more pro-Harris. I don't know if they're more pro-Trump. And also, they are assuming a certain model of the electorate, which again is different than it usually is. For example, we know from almost every poll that the gender gap, the so-called gender gap, men are much more pro-Trump, women are much more pro-Harris. But which is going to turn out more? Traditionally, women have turned out a little bit more, but that doesn't mean it's going to happen this time. What's more, the Trump campaign has focused on lower propensity voters, voters that don't always come out. Now, will he get them? If he does, that changes the calculation. We don't know. Another thing that is worth thinking about is that in this cycle, you have seen a lot of different voters that traditionally vote Republican are unsatisfied with Trump as the nominee. There's somewhere between 10 and 20% that very much don't like Trump as the nominee. What do they do? A lot of them voted for Nikki Haley in the primary. I'm one of those people. I voted for Nikki Haley in the primary. I'm a former Republican staffer. And I'm not happy with it personally. And this is just me talking personally. But what do those voters do? And where are they located? And so, in other words, if a Nikki Haley voter in California or Texas or Alabama is unhappy, that doesn't really matter much. Now, if a Nikki Haley voter in Wisconsin or Pennsylvania is unhappy and they decide either to not vote or vote for Harris, that changes things. But also, that choice itself changes things. Do they vote for Harris affirmatively, or do they simply not vote for president? All these things can matter depending on how close the election is. So it's very hard to tell with any degree of certainty where this is going. I think we'll probably know a lot more when we start seeing numbers, but given the fact that we're all looking at, a very non-traditional election, even that we might not know for a while. It all depends on how close it is.
So when you're talking about Nikki Haley, there are also figures like, say, for example, Robert Kennedy, and then Tulsi Gabbard and all. Are they bringing their own voters also with them, or is there some kind of dissatisfaction over there?
It's very hard to say. Kennedy himself was a very odd figure. I mean, the Kennedy name, such a huge legacy in America, former president, often seen as sort of a martyr president, John F. Kennedy, his brother Robert Kennedy and his brother Ted Kennedy. I mean, and even their grandsons. You had Joe Kennedy and Patrick Kennedy. I mean, you've had Kennedys in office in one form or another in America for decades. Robert Kennedy was always kind of the oddball. He never ran for office until he ran for president and then dropped out. He was, however, considered to be a leading candidate for a cabinet position in an Al Gore administration had Al Gore won in 2000. But Al Gore didn't win, and he wasn't. And so now he ran for president and then ended up changing sides to vote for the Republican. What constituency does he speak for? I think he speaks for some, and his name is interesting to people. Does he have many voters? Where are they going? I don't know, and I'm not really sure anybody else does. Gabbard is another person that certainly has a strong following among Hindu Americans and Indian Americans more broadly. She has some following, sort of from the disaffected in both parties. But again, who are those voters? Where are they? Are they in, the important places they need to be? A lot harder to tell because, candidates like that, I mean, they mean a lot to certain people, but you got to remember she represented one district in one state, when she was actually in office. So, while they might have a very small following, we're talking about, a tenth of a percent nationally or something like that. If the race is very close, like we've seen before, I mean, races, in states are decided by 1,000 votes, that can matter, but it's very hard to know with any degree of certainty where those votes are.
So what about the disaffection on the Democratic side? I'm hearing that there is a lot of disaffection even there.
Certainly, it's a different kind of disaffection. I mean, you've seen, for example, a lot there. For one thing that you might not know about in India, there was a kind of a big deal in a very small segment of society here was a few years ago, a woman named Bari Weiss. She was a columnist for the New York Times. She was a very hard person to categorize. She was a woman. She was a lesbian. She was a Democrat. She was also Jewish, and she became very disillusioned with what she saw as anti-Semitism and bad reporting in the New York Times, and left and started her own media empire. Now, she's very hard to categorize, but she used to be a Democrat, and other people that think like her, some of them are Jewish, some are not. They have their own way of looking at things. They're very upset about what they would see as race essentialism in school curriculum. They're very concerned about the way transgender issues have been handled. They're very concerned about the way the media acts, and they don't fit neatly. Most of them are former Democrats, and they don't fit neatly into sort of our current political categories. Where are they going to go? I'm not sure. The white working class, so-called, is a demographic that Trump has appealed to his whole career in politics. He certainly has done better among them, and they've drifted more to the Republican side than they have. But that's an old story. The question really isn't if the white working class is going to vote for Trump. A lot of them are, certainly a lot more than they have traditional Republicans. But by what margins and where? And are they swamped by other numbers? That's the kind of thing we're looking at. It's very hard to tell.
And you see, I don't know whether it's unfair or not, perhaps unfair. I have been talking to a lot of people in the US, and there is a distinct fear, especially among the Trump voters, I would say, and Republicans, that there's a possibility of these elections being rigged. What do you, they're somehow really worried about that. They think that Trump should win this election, but if he doesn't win, that is rigged. What is your view on that?
I am totally against that idea. I think America has very clean elections. I think that if you ever actually worked on a campaign and know how it works, particularly nowadays, I mean, especially, in the 2000 election, you had, so a lot of very complicated issues of hanging chads and stuff, but we're talking about a quarter century ago. We've done a lot to modernize our elections. Frankly, that narrative came along after Trump looked like he was going to lose, and I think they did it more to preserve his political viability going forward. That narrative has taken hold, though. I don't think it's true, and I think that everybody that looks at it knows it's not true. You had a number of Trump's own appointed judges deny his legal challenges. You have currently former top-level Republican judges. Just recently, one named Thomas Griffin, I believe his name was. There's so many I've lost track of them all, to be honest, but wrote a big expose on a panel that him and several other Republican appointed judges came to the conclusion that there was nothing to these claims. I could name many, many, many other such you know analysis that comes to the same conclusion. Nonetheless, while I am confident that is completely untrue, I do think that is a real perception that I do fear taints the process somewhat. Obviously, elections are much more legitimate if they are accepted by, the vast majority of people. Historically, when you had Kennedy Nixon in 1960, Al Gore versus George W. Bush in 2000, these extremely close elections, both parties, both candidates, both sides accepted the results and tried to help the country move forward. I do fear that might not happen. In fairness, Hillary Clinton wasn't always helpful after her loss to Donald Trump. She talked a lot about Russian interference and all this stuff, which it had a grain of truth to it, but wasn't the real story. And I think, neither side has their hand totally clean, but I hope that that is not the direction we go. I fear that it might be.
Okay. What about Kamala Harris as a figure? How inspiring, or I mean, is she being able to convert, I would say, the independents, the swing voters towards her? Or what is
I do.
going on? What sort of figure is she?
She is a very complicated figure. I mean, we've never had a woman of African American heritage at the top of the ticket. We've never had a person of, Indian American heritage anywhere near anything like that. And that's man or woman. Closest is probably Bobby Jindal in Louisiana. But there's other factors too. I mean, she is from California, not exactly a traditional swing state. And frankly, her track record up to this point has been mediocre. I mean, California is a pretty safe bet to elect Democrats under most circumstances, and yet she almost lost her race for attorney general in 2010 to a Republican. She only won by about 1%. When Jerry Brown, the governor's candidate at the time, was winning by what? I think 13. When she ran for president in 2019, she didn't get very far. She flamed out before Iowa. So she definitely has some weak points. I do not think she is also this way. I do not think she has the raw political talent of someone like Barack Obama, or on the Republican side, maybe Ronald Reagan or something. She just doesn't. Having said all that, I think since the Joe Biden withdrew from the race, since she became the nominee, she's been far from perfect. I could name a number of different problems, things she could have done better, but she's been better than she might have been, and better than some feared. Some thought that she would end up, being sort of as closer to her 2019 self. She's clearly done better than she did in 2019. She's clearly learned some things. She's clearly matured as vice president, and so I think that she's been a better candidate than some feared, or perhaps some hoped on the Republican side. Um, and so when you look at independents, I will say there has been a movement toward her from independent voters. Um, I'd have to go look it up, but there was a writer for the National Review, who's a right-leaning news outlet that of some importance in America, that was writing that there appears to be a move towards Harris in the polls in the last week or so. They cited a number of polls, perhaps the most important. There was a poll in Iowa. Now, Iowa is a very important primary state, and it used to be a swing state. I mean, George W. Bush, for example, lost it in 2000 but won it in 2004. Both times it was fairly close. However, Barack Obama carried it twice easily, and then Trump carried it twice easily. So it's a very odd state, and it was considered to be very strongly Trump. This poll that came out just a few days ago, a pollster that has gotten Iowa very close to correct multiple cycles in a row, actually showed Harris ahead in Iowa. Now, is that an outlier? It might well be. We don't know. However, if it is true, and what the poll basically showed was women supporting Harris at a freakishly high margin, if that's true, and if especially if that's true outside of Iowa, and it showed I should say it showed independent women going even more strongly for Harris than in other polls. If that's true, and particularly if it speaks outside of Iowa, which again there are other polls that at least suggest that's possible, um, this could be an early night. We could know very early. But again, there's a lot of unknowns, and a lot of these polls are based on voter models that we're not 100% sure apply because, again, this is such a weird election.
Yeah, because you see, when you are looking at how much of a burden is Biden's legacy on Harris, if at all?
Oh, it's definitely a burden. Biden, here's the problem. Voters did not like the drama of the Trump presidency. Things were always on fire, was the perception. There was always a crisis, there was always a controversy. And then you had COVID, which was at best handled unpredictably. He got a few things right and a lot of things wrong. Depending who you talked to, he got one thing or the other, but the situation was not popular. And it was not, and that's why Biden, who, had run for president multiple times before, admittedly had served as vice president to a popular president for 8 years, but he was hired in essence to make things normal. But things haven't been normal during his presidency. You had, um, the end of the pandemic, which was mostly good, but you had him shove a lot of money into the economy with the stimulus package, which he, called the Inflation Reduction package, which didn't reduce inflation. Now, I think it's fair to say that you would have had inflation without Joe Biden. I also think it's true you probably made it worse. You had the withdrawal from Afghanistan, which I think was almost universally seen as a debacle. Now, people that disagree with why or who's responsible, people will point out, for example, that it was Trump, not Biden, that signed the Doha agreement that led to the pullout. However, what happened, what people saw happen on their TV, was under Biden, and that was not popular. And I could go on and on. The perception, and I think it's partly fair and partly exaggerated, but partly fair, is that things have not been normal and things have not been great. And what's even worse, it became clearer and clearer to people that Biden was not up for another 4 years, and a number of people, including Harris, to be fair, sort of, oh no, he's fine, everything's good. When clearly it became clear later he just, look, you get older, sometimes you're just not as quick on your feet as you're used to be. You're not as able to do the job that he was fading, and the sort of the perception that that was hidden from people stuck with a lot. And Harris has to overcome all that. Now, I think she's gone a long way to doing so. There has been at least some polling to suggest that, constituencies that were cold to her, a few months ago have warmed to her. I think that she's gone a long way to sort of separate herself, at least in some ways, from some of Biden's more unpopular policies or more unpopular statements. She's at least tried. Um, I don't know how much that's going to take effect. I think it's taken some effect. The question is, in such a weird election with potentially such close states, is it enough? Again, I hate having to keep saying this, but I don't know. When you're seeing things like we're seeing, competing ideas and in polls that are within a point or two, it's very hard to know what's going to happen. But I do think there's no doubt that um, Biden has been a drag on Harris.
Yeah.
He has not helped her, and it's not anything he's done personally per se. It's not like he hasn't been willing to campaign or anything. Just his legacy is at best mixed, and it is not something helpful because people didn't like the way things were in 2020, so they elected Biden, and now people don't things like the way things are going in 2024. So, but you have a former president, which they didn't like the way things are going, and a vice president, and they don't like the way things are going. So how does that shake out? Again, it only speaks to just how weird this election is.
And when you're talking about different ideas, what about this, because we are reading a lot about that Harris being a DEI candidate,
Hmm.
and then there is the issues like transgender, wokeism. Is
Hmm.
that resulting in, apart from division in, and this illegal immigrant problem,
Oh
illegal
yeah,
immigration,
those
how
are
are
all
these issues, the
those are all
social
big.
issues?
I think the Harris as a DEI candidate is something that the right has said that frankly is probably hurting them more than it's helping. I mean, it's something that some of their people believe in. And in fairness, Biden gave it, a plausible enough veneer because he said he wanted to pick a woman and he kind of implied he wanted to pick an African American woman and then he picks an African American woman and people, oh, look, this is just an affirmative action candidate or whatever, a DEI candidate. But look, I mean, Harris had won, three elections, admittedly not super impressively, but in a big state with a lot of money. She was a national figure. I think that, and look, to a certain degree, all vice presidential candidates are, identity candidates, right? You pick someone because they bring a
Hmm.
certain racial demographic or a certain state or a certain ethnic demographic or an economic demographic. So, I don't really think that flies. I don't think that changes any votes. Some of these other issues you're raising are different. I mean, immigration was completely bungled by the Biden administration for, at minimum, the first 2.5 years of his presidency. He was beholden to the far left, and he gave the right a huge issue to attack him on justifiably. I mean, the kind of, mass migration you saw and uncontrolled, problem that just he just didn't seem to want to control. That perception stuck, and that's been very hard. Harris has tried to move to the center on that. I think she's done okay, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to work. And I think that's a big problem for her. I think that, um, you know, let's just put it this way. If she loses, I think you'll be able to draw a very direct line to two issues, and that is immigration and inflation. I think inflation, Biden deserves some blame for, but I don't ultimately think it was his issue, his fault. Immigration, he could have done a lot more to neutralize that problem, and he simply didn't. And if she loses, that'll be a huge part of it.
Okay, last question, Cliff. Uh, how should the world look at either of the two presidents? What can the world expect from either a Harris presidency or a Trump presidency?
I think with Harris, you will see a similar presidency to Biden, but actually moved a shade or two to the right on most issues. It's funny because Joe Biden was seen as the more moderate candidate, and Harris is seen as was seen in more left wing, particularly when they both ran for president in 2019, 2020. However, frankly, the country has moved to the right on a lot of these issues. And at the end of the day, Harris, whatever her personal convictions, is a politician, and she moves where the votes are. I think that's pretty clear if you look at her history. I don't think she's an ideologically driven candidate the way some are, certainly not to the degree. So, I think you will see a more moderate version of the Biden presidency on most issues, should she win. Um, Trump is very hard to predict. I mean, on some level, you want to say you know what he's going to be because you've seen it before. However, last time, quite frankly, um, I heard a commentator say this a couple days ago, and I think it was right on. Last time, Mike Pence was his vice president. Mike Pence was a Christian conservative, a longtime stalwart of the Republican Party, almost the poster child for the mainstream of the Republican Party and its biggest constituencies in one man. This time he picked J.D. Vance. Now, J.D. Vance is not only fairly new to politics, I mean, he wasn't even on the public's eye before 2016, but he also is something of an isolationist populist. And that's the person he picked to be vice president. What's more, I believe it is 40 of Trump's 44 cabinet members have not endorsed his reelection. A lot of them don't like him and don't think he's right for office. Um, so who staffs those positions? Who ends up being influential in his administration? Because it's quite clear through history, through his own statements, that Trump is not driven by the things traditional politicians are. And by that, I don't mean traditional politicians in a, Georgetown cocktails party sense. I mean in a he thinks just on non-political terms, more like a game show host or like a TV show host. And you know, so who staffs his administration is very important. And given that the vast majority of people from his first administration are not coming back, and he's very clearly signaled that he doesn't see his main constituency being the mainstay of the Republican Party, as represented by Mike Pence, we don't know what we're going to see. It's going to be something perhaps very different.
Yeah, that's different. I mean, that is what I guess inside the next 24 hours, we'll have a fairly good idea about which way the election is headed.
We'll see.
Unless, of course, there is a 2020 like repeat situation.
Yep.
Then I think everything is absolutely all hell breaks loose.
I will
Thank
say
you.
one last thing.
Yeah,
One last
Joyeeta.
thing is that I think in 2020, Trump lost, but he actually overperformed his polls somewhat. In 2022, after the Dobbs decision came down, which put abortion, which is a very contentious issue, into the middle of the political foray, you saw Democrats overperform their polls considerably in a number of races for Senate, for Congress, so on and so forth. So you have a real interesting question. I think to me, this is the ultimate unknown question of the election. When you're seeing all these close polls, maybe every swing state's within a point or two. I kind of doubt it. The truth of the matter is, I think it is more likely that either this is a 2020 like election where Donald Trump will overperform his polls, or this is a 2022 election where Democrats will overperform theirs. Which one? Well, give me a day or two and I'll let you know.
Thank you. Thank you, Cliff, for speaking with me. And thank you, viewers, for watching. Until the next time.